Welcome to MacGyver's Workshop, where you never know what we're going to be working on next. If you're not too careful, you just might learn something.
Welcome back to another episode of MacGyver's Workshop, where you never know what we're going to be working on next, and if you're not too careful, you just might learn something. Now, listen carefully. Hear that buzzing? Those are my metal halide shop lights. And I actually had a viewer the other day make a comment on it and say, you know, well, they make filters and all this, that, and the other, and for the life of me, I just haven't had any luck getting them sorted. But you know, I really haven't tried too hard either, because I've always wanted to convert the shop over to LED lighting. And when we finished building our house, we put all LEDs in there, and it really makes a heck of a difference. So, but now that the technology's come along a little ways, and yeah, we got a project coming. I'm gonna convert the shop over to LEDs. So stay tuned for that. And today we're going to be working on the Ole Blue project here. And today I'm going to show you how to change the axle bearings, or axle shaft bearings, out on a Ford 9-inch. So there's plenty of videos out there, you know, imagine it will show you how to do it. But I'll go into my usual nitty-gritty detail and give you all the little shortcuts and gotchas to avoid and all that good stuff. So let's get started. All right, to begin, of course, you're going to want to take all your brake hardware off, and wheel cylinder and all that good stuff. But in this case, we are. Now, if you were just going to change an axle bearing, you wouldn't need to do any of that. You could leave it all in place. But since we're taking everything down and cleaning everything up, making it all look new again, I have everything all torn apart on here. But as I said, for the purposes of just swapping out an axle bearing, you wouldn't need to do all that. Now, what you've got is you have a hole in your axle flange here, and you have 4 bolts, 2 on each side, on a rectangular flange in the back here. So what we'll do is, in this case, this is a 1982 year model, so it's going to be metric. It's going to be 14 millimeter, and you just line your axle up and get it on there. And there's the back side here. We'll take a look over and go behind and show you how that's set up. As you can see, these have they're kind of T-shaped, and they'll hold against the axle housing, but you may just want to put your finger, you know, keep it pressed up against the flange while you're running the nut off on the other side. And then you just spin it off. Now, these are locking nuts, so they're going to act like they're fighting you the whole way, so don't worry too much about that. And there you go. Do that for the other 3, and Bob's your uncle, they say. Sometimes you may get lucky and this thing will just slide out for you, but most likely not. So you'll have to use usually have to put you a slide hammer on here and just give her a couple of easy taps and it'll come right on out of there. Now to do that, Just take your regular old, footed slide hammer. Get you a couple of lug nuts there. Get it on there like so. Give her a couple of smacks. And out she comes. Easy peasy. Now I'm going to show you something here where there's a bit of a difference. You can tell between one side and the other where, looking at this bearing here, and we'll get a closer look at it in a minute, doesn't really look too terrible. But when you compare it next to the other one, you'll see just how bad that other one is. So it's always a good idea. Take your scribe and mark your axles there, just so you make sure you put it back together with everything on the same side as you took it apart on. Seeing a little bit of sand from the wet blaster, but that's okay. We're going to clean all this stuff up and wash it off anyway. But you can see a pretty marked difference between that bearing and this bearing. So like I said, I'm gonna replace them both anyway, but yeah, that one's pretty trashed. So, and this is the one that was leaking gear oil as well. So we're gonna square all that up and put it back just as nice as can be. There's a couple ways you can remove these bearings from this shaft. Now, the way they always tell you to do it, the official way, is to use a hydraulic press and a bearing separator like this. Okay, and what happens is this is like a real thin little lip right there that you can see, and you put it right under here and then apply pressure to the shaft and press it through. Well, I don't really care to do that, because usually what happens is you don't have a whole lot to get on right there, okay, and it'll damage this little plate here, and sometimes it'll even push this whole plate through over the top of the bearing, because it doesn't go in far enough to catch on the inner race of the bearing. And as you can see, you can't really get in there too good. It's a real challenge to do that. So thankfully there's really a lot easier way, and the only thing you have to be careful about with it, or the only thing is you have to be a little careful. And what we'll do is we'll use our cutting wheel, and we'll just cut at an angle across here and get it down about 9/10 of the way, and then stick a chisel in the cut and tap it a couple times, and it'll split that collar and it'll come right off. And we'll do the same thing with the bearing. We'll cut some of this seal out of the way and cut this cage and get all the rollers and get all that out of the way, and then do the same thing, cut at an angle across the inner race, and when we get about 9/10 of the way through it, and pop it with a chisel, and it'll split, and then that way you're not this bearing and this collar are a very tight interference fit. So each time you press something on or off, you're abrading this inner axle surface, and in effect making it a little smaller each time. So it's very important that that collar fit nice and tight, because that's what pretty much holds the axle in the car. So I just have always, cut them off. But you got to be careful, because you don't want to go too deep and then end up cutting a groove in the axle shaft. That's never good. So get your grinder ready, and always remember, lube your tools up. These tools are very expensive, so always a good idea to take good care of them. And of course, always wear eye protection. Don't be stupid. Alrighty, so as you see, I've got my axle chucked up in a vise here. I just wrapped it with a shop rag just to protect the axle shaft a little bit, and got my air tool all lubed up, and we'll get cracking here. Got my safety glasses on. We're ready to rock and roll here. About a 45-degree angle is what you want. Patience is key here, because you're cutting down through about a ½ inch of hardened steel, so don't try to push too hard into your tool or anything like that. Let the tool do the work, and like I said, your patience will be rewarded, especially by being careful not to go all the way through this collar and then gouge your axle shaft. We don't want that. Now what's interesting here, normally you'll have to cut down through and then get inside your cut line there with a chisel, and or in my case an air chisel, and give it a few wraps with it to split that collar. But this one actually, and you'll get lucky on occasion, this one actually split on its own as I was cutting it. So we got real lucky there. It split and just popped right off of there. So you get lucky like that every now and again. Now eventually you can work your way around this cage to where you can get this back side of the roller cage to where you can get to it. And then if you have to, just give it a quick whiz with the wheel, or if you got some heavy duty enough snips, you can cut through it. But again, the object is to not gouge or damage our backing plate. There we go. These little rollers will go everywhere, like I said. So what I'll do, I'll try and catch them here as best I can as I peel this cage out of the way. Good pair of pliers. And there we go. Always helps to have a scrap metal bucket laying around. And then we'll be left with our inner race here. Now this one is going to take a little more care, because you're going to have to go back in here and make sure you don't hit this retainer plate as best you can. So Unfortunately, this one's not as thick as the collar is, so it shouldn't take quite as long. Now here's when you want to pay particular attention and be careful and make sure you don't go all the way through that bearing. That's because we don't want to gall up the surface of the axle shaft. So we want to make sure and be real careful. This is definitely a situation where you want to measure 5 times and cut once. There we go. Split right on off of there. Yeah, buddy. So, we've got our collar off, our inner race, our cage and rollers are of course in the scrap bucket. And this is the axle seal. And this is the retainer plate, which you can see how, you know, that was leaking gear oil for quite some time. But we're going to sort all that out. And then next step we're going to do, we're going to clean this axle up real nice and make sure our sealing surface is good, and make sure we're going to mic our surface right here where the bearing goes on and the collar. We want to measure this outside diameter and the new bearing and collar's inside diameter. It should be a pretty significant interference fit. So, as I said, because that's what holds that axle in the car. So we don't want those things popping off. So, and your new bearing comes with dimensions to check for. It's kind of a go no go for your axle shaft. So what we've got here is, looks like the old seal had worn some grooves into the sealing surface on the axle shaft. So what we're going to do is we're going to order up some repair sleeves. It's basically a real thin hard metal sleeve that'll slide down over here and give the seal a nice new flat surface to ride on. So that's going to put this project, or this phase of the project, at a halt for the time being, because thanks to Cash for Clunkers, you can't buy these parts readily at the parts store anymore. So we have to order them special, which will take a while for them to come in. So thanks for watching and stay tuned.